everybody. Okay, so we are live, and we should be live on Facebook right now. So welcome everybody. This is session 6 of PKD, VALIS, and Practices of Ultra Meta-Cognition. We are with Richard Doyle of Penn State, as we are every Monday in the evening, to talk about one of PKD's books, Philip K. Dick's books. And this week we're talking about VALIS. And I'm really excited about this one. This is sort of, we're intensifying our reading, right, as we go through his bibliography into VALIS now. And VALIS is a super meta text, which is both autobiographical, it's an extension of the exegesis, and it's kind of, well, we're going to find out. So yeah, welcome everybody. And if you're joining us from Facebook, you will quickly learn the kind of weirdness that this class truly is. And I hope you enjoy and continue to read with us. And if you are joining us for the first time, all of the previous sessions are recorded already, and they should be on Neura, and especially in our YouTube channel. And if you sign up for our class, which is linked in the description, that will also get you onto the class portal, which has all of the downloads, and it has the afterword to the exegesis written by Richard Doyle, and a couple of the other materials that we've been gathering throughout the weeks. So I definitely recommend that, plugging in that way. And yeah, I just want to welcome Rich to pass on the mic and get us started tonight with VALIS.
Thanks, Jeremy, and thanks everybody who's checking it out one way or another. I do think it's an incredible opportunity to not only read VALIS, but to read it in the context of these other books, you know, that we've gotten into a rhythm of at least going for reading a book a week and experiencing those trance states, which are at least as powerful as synchronicity music, and you know, to allow ourselves to observe the way in which reading itself is a practice, a deep practice of altering consciousness and entering into other states of awareness that can allow us to explore what we've been terming, along with PKD, ultra metacognition, where we get to train our minds to observe as we engage in the practice of reading. So we're reading and we're watching the effect that the reading has on us, and then we're wondering over the identity of the reader. So this sense of wonder, I think, is part of what is nerve-wracking about reading PKD's books. Sometimes they can give us that panicky feel because we don't have a real firm grasp on the boundary between the book and ourselves, so we can feel like, you know, it's a different movie every time, as one of the characters in VALIS says about VALIS. That's impossible. But we can experience that when we read these books as well, that because these books are assays, A-S-S-A-Y-S, you know, that kind of technical scientific sense, that they're sort of lighting up different parts of us each time we read them. You know, just as we assay a sequence of DNA, we can make different parts of it glow using different assays. And each time we come to one of these books, and having just read another of the books, you know, it can affect this, that we respond differently. We're mirrored differently in our experience of the book. So I'm hoping that people are enjoying this kind of deeply unfashionable and actually downright difficult practice of spelunking around in the experiences of our own minds while we're reading texts that are about spelunking around in our own minds. That all can sound very navel-gazing, but I actually think it's of well-nigh evolutionary import, that we're facing a kind of attentional crisis on the planet, where the feedback loops that our own awareness makes with the planet have become obviously lethal and also depressing and anxiety-inducing and ill. In other words, we're making ourselves ill with the form of attention that we're exerting or not exerting on the planet. And that form of the attention clusters around that experience of being an I, of this kind of impression that we have that the world is organized according to this sort of division of labor among selves that are all separate from each other and engaged in non-zero sum games with each other, where we're constantly at war with each other. As Hobbes put it, the war of all, against all. But in fact, what Dick's books do, they're a kind of antidote to, this Maya that we find ourselves living in, that this kind of illusion that each of us, is born alone, dies alone, suffers alone, that in fact, we're all part of a deeply interconnected, self-aware entity that Dick will call, in this book, VALIS, where the vast active living intelligent system can seem shocking, disturbing, bizarre, even mad at first. But that shock and that disturbance is in response to a false map of the world that each of us can experience most of our lives, which is this map of the world that says that the world makes sense as a set of divided eyes, all in competition with each other. But if even for a moment we can experience, for example, as PKD does, a continuum, for example, across time. So, AD 50 or AD 70 Rome can appear totally continuous with our own time of 2018, not because we're insane or hallucinating, but because we're momentarily experiencing the continuity of time as well as its discrete character, right? We're aware of its discrete character, which is divided. It can be divided up into chunks, but it can only be divided up into chunks on the condition of our conceptualizing it and mapping it. When we experience it, it's continuous. And if we can experience that continuity of time, we can experience the way in which, yes, actually, AD 70 Rome is still present right now in a very real way. Otherwise, where did it go? and you can say, well, it went into the past, right? But the past, as we're going to see in, as this novel narrates it, is itself a kind of fiction, right? It's a useful fiction at times, but it's a fiction. So experiencing the fictional quality of our own world by following along as Philip K. Dick experiences the fictional quality of his own identity as a character, Phil, or the character Horse Lover Fat, is a kind of deep training in recognizing reality, which you'll remember, is that which doesn't go away just because we stop believing in it. And I think VALIS is an experiment in the author not believing in the reality of his own identity, in kind of recognizing that he's what the software people would call an instance. In other words, that is running of a more fundamental underlying logic that could be Bob Archer, could be Fred, could be Horse Lover Fat, could be Phil, could be Phil K. Dick. And that there's a deeper well of awareness out of which each of these instances manifest, stations in one mind, as the tractate puts it at a certain point. And that the deeper well is, sometimes worth labeling as VALIS, which I think is worth noting is a vast, so beyond magnitude, beyond scale, not fathomable by us. We can't say where it is because it is ubiquitous. We can't create a map of where it is and where it isn't because it is the all, right? Active, meaning it's not inert, it's not some dead background, mechanical background against which things transpire. It's in fact vibrant, alive, vital, sentient, self-aware, and it's living, right? It's actually engaged in this project of dissipating large amounts of energy in thermodynamic systems and maintaining itself in what biologists in the 1950s and 60s called autopoiesis, a self-organizing system. So it's the vast, active, living, intelligent. And here, intelligent doesn't just mean able to problem solve or fix puzzles or hack a CAPTCHA, right? but intelligent means capable of large-scale pattern recognition and awareness of that pattern recognition, what we've been calling in these discussions ultra meta-cognition. And it's a system, which is the good old antidote to thinking that it's somehow isolated in one place and that we could narrow it down and find it like a God outside of us rather than a God which suffuses us. The vast active living intelligent system is a system. So it's really, in some sense, not an entity. An entity would be a thing localizable in space and time, but a system includes this kind of dynamic aspect of itself. It's ongoing, it's changing, it's a process. So VALIS is, in a way, a process novel. It's a novel about characters coming to experience the fact, and not just understand. In fact, they don't understand, but experience and try to fathom the fact that they're not who they think they were, that they thought they were, because they're processes, they're not entities, right? That is neither fill nor fat, but in fact, this process by which fill and fat come into being. So that's why I find VALIS to be what I'm calling in the first part of this discussion a kind of hierogma strategy, right? Which is, it's a kind of testimony by Philip K. Dick in the form of a fiction of what he takes to be the ontology of the world, what the nature of the world is, what kind of world it is that we live in, and not just like who we are and what it's like to be a human being, but what we are. And what we are is, we appear to be memory coils of active DNA. We appear to be information systems capable of self-awareness. Now, on the one hand, that's kind of very obvious because, we've modeled so much of the external world, including computer networks and living systems themselves, as informational beings of DNA, as information systems. But I think most of us have not really experienced ourselves as information systems. We think, for example, that we have a simple location as an identity in space and time, when if we conceptualize ourselves as an information system rather than a material system, that's actually not so, because who we are, therefore, depends on what scale we're applying to our inputs and outputs or informational productions. So this impression that we have that we're localized in time here in 2018 is the result of a very particular kind of snapshot of who, quote unquote, we are, when in fact we are a developmental process that has been ongoing and is still ongoing, for the entirety of our lives. So taking this snapshot of us here as saying, this is me, is already a kind of arbitrary snapshot of something which is essentially a process and not a chunk of a process. So I think that when we start to grapple with the idea that we're informational beings, first of all, we realize that our boundaries are not what we thought they were. We're leaky, right? We're starting to discover this as informational beings, that, information doesn't stay in one place. That's not one of the things that it does. And that this impression of linear time is just that. Linear time is a way that we use to organize the information that we take in and we give out. But linear time is not, as we were discussing earlier, our experience of time. Our experience of time is itself a continuum, a process. So remembering this, I think, can be deeply healing, because, the word healing comes from the German word heilig, which means holy or to be made whole. That to be healed means to feel ourselves return to or become a part of a whole, W-H-O-L-E. And that's kind of become, a deeply unfashionable thing to think about, that we could somehow be integrated as an aspect of a larger whole. But if we think about the process of healing ourselves, that it can occur in a kind of mundane or even, sacred fashion, it involves, reintegrating ourselves in some ways. It involves, like if we have a wound, our body engages in self-repair and reintegrates that part of our body, hopefully, into the rest of our body. It reestablishes itself as this process. And when we feel separate from each other, when we struggle under this narrative of the I, then we feel separate from each other. We feel like fragments. And that's why we feel incomplete. That's why we feel separate from each other. But when we start to remember that we're the kind of informational system that I think PKD is teaching us about in VALIS and elsewhere, then this is why I call this the Kyrgyz strategy, because it's almost his preaching and saying, hey, remember, you actually could be suffused by pink light at any moment. Experiment with the idea that you are currently being suffused by pink light or white light or whatever light happens to manifest in your mind's eye. And that kind of practice of experimenting with the idea of yourself as a being of light, right, is both a fictional strategy that Dick is deploying. He's trying to get us to experience ourselves and to experience one of his characters as being at least momentarily suffused with light. And that when we'll do that, it will draw into question those boundaries which we took for granted, those boundaries that tell us that we're separate from each other and that it's natural to suffer. And then, of course, we're a fragment alienated from a larger whole. And to just momentarily really feel the reality of our interconnection with all things. And that light as a phenomenon is useful for visualizing this because of its nature as something which suffuses, right? It doesn't defeat darkness. It's not the enemy of darkness. It simply suffuses darkness, right? And so teaching us how to experience ourselves as being suffused is both, the Kyrgyz strategy, right? So the preaching, and it's the story, because I call it the Kyrgyz strategy because you might remember that Dick was excited about the Blade Runner movie, not because he liked the movie, because he thought the movie had a kind of fascist overtone for his tastes, but because it would get people to read the book. And that in a certain way, VALIS is a fake book, that it pretends to be a novel about these characters that come into contact with VALIS, the phenomenon for Horse Lover Fat, and VALIS, the movie, for the rest of the characters, as well as Horse Lover Fat. But really, it's introducing elements of the tractate into popular discourse as a way of trying to diffuse this preaching, this teaching about our nature as informational beings, as agnostic informational beings that can know their own nature, that in reflecting upon themselves, we can know that we're informational beings. And that by understanding ourselves by informational beings, we're both likely to get a little bit disturbed because our ordinary worldview is going to be put into disarray, but also there's the possibility of being healed. And that what we can perhaps be healed of is the very thing that Horse Lover Fat is at least momentarily healed of, which is the idea that we are a self in the first place, right? The idea that we have this characteristic as an I, and that it's our job to somehow make sense of even a single moment of our existence, which eludes our capacity to put into language, and which Horse Lover Fat scribbles in his exegesis night after night, right? So that's kind of part one, which is to suggest this Kyrgyz strategy that PKD is perhaps deploying a method similar to that of the Bhagavad Gita, where the Bhagavad Gita was a scriptural text inserted into the Mahabharata, which is a long, I think, 100,000 verse text, which features, all kinds of very spectacular, epic battles and even sort of soap opera elements that gets our attention. But right in the midst of it, you have this very deep spiritual teaching, which itself takes place on a battlefield. And I want to suggest that the kerygma strategy of VALIS is precisely to insert the nugget, the crystal of the exegesis into a novelistic form so that it might kind of lay dormant within us. We don't really understand it right away. It kind of, like as Dick says about Parsifal, or as Phil says about Parsifal, that it seems like it makes sense, and then upon reflection we say to ourselves, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. And of course that's why it makes sense, because it calls us to take a higher level abstraction and observe the nature of our own reality and perceive it for what it is, which is VALIS, the vast active living intelligence system, which would be both, of course, a kind of heavy quotes, new name for God, but also a name for God which is more adequate to our experience of the divine, because our experience of the divine is, for example, as Phil and Fat find out when they head up to Sonoma, Dionysian, meaning that we lose our sense of self. We become intoxicated in the presence of the divine, and we don't know who we are. We don't know what our name is in the presence of the divine. So that can be deeply disturbing. That can make us even think that people that talk this way, as Eric Lambton and Linda Lambton do, are crazy, right? I mean, that's the hilarious thing, that the Ripidon Society shows up, meets the Friends of God, and becomes convinced that they're crazy, even though, of course, it's confirming their own theophany. It's confirming their own revelation. They meet someone else who shares that revelation, and they themselves are crazy, which I think returns us to Dick's sense of humor as wanting to keep it undecidable, right? Is Dick saying that VALIS is God? Well, yes and no, right? Dick is saying, I think, that if we imagine, the highest possible abstraction that we're capable of imagining that out of which all of this emerges, that we might come up with a science fiction concept such as VALIS, where we think of it not as a thing, but as a vast active living intelligence system, a diffused network of signaling that is beyond space and time, because it is that which brings into being space and time, that information is more fundamental than space or time in this cosmology. But also that, as we're experiencing that information entirely through our own minds, that we need to always remember that, what is rational, and the rational is an important category in VALIS. The rational is that which knows what the limitations of the mind are, that there is something beyond the mind that the mind must kind of surrender to if it's going to be rational, paradoxically enough. It must lose itself if it's going to make sense. It must not think that it understands everything. It has to keep a sense of mirth and a sense of humor, and be comfortable in the uncertainty of, whether or not, in fact, one has just met the friends of God, or one has just met some deeply deluded human beings that think they're descended from three-eyed alien invaders on Earth, and that's a beautiful thing, that our ability to abide in the state of uncertainty and not knowing is, in fact, part of our epic quest, right? That can we continue to navigate this space of both gnosis, we know what we are, but also not knowing what we are is going to do next, right? In other words, that there's a kind of journey that we're on of self-knowledge, and that journey of self-knowledge continues to deepen, and that just as we think we've got it figured out, we'll be watching TV late at night, and it seems like there'll be some sort of a cipher between, a commercial and a TV show, and that cipher is King Felix. And that maybe it's as simple as that King Felix, is the sign that Anadam Paramam Manamidam Drisham Na Kinshana, that Ananda bliss is the highest metric, that King Felix is so, because if we're experiencing a kind of happiness that is all about releasing our suffering and releasing our sense of being fragmented and alone and individual, then we're on the right path, right? Not that we're on the right path if we feel good in some sort of narcissistic way, but if we can feel that underneath these temporary instances that we are, that there's deep joy to be had in the universe, and that the universe is, even in some tantric sense, made out of joy. And that if we can begin to feel the fundamental nature of VALIS, we can begin to feel that joy. And that's deeply healing. That why wouldn't we want to be healed of this like kind of nightmare of depression and anxiety and chronic attempts to cognize and figure out what's going on, and instead realize what we are, and realizing what we are, to go back to point towards the exegesis, to be able to experience each other as beings of agape, because agape doesn't have boundaries either. If we want to map what it's like to be a boundaryless being, we don't need to go anywhere else but into a state of agape. And then agape exists where we release our own self-interest, which doesn't mean that we suffer. It doesn't mean we self-sacrifice. It simply means we let go, even gently, of our own self-interest. And we feel what that feels like. And when we feel what that feels like, those apparent boundaries that we feel, that we think are there between each other, they're not there. Like the obligations that we feel towards each other, the love that we feel towards each other, the joy we feel in interacting with another human being is an empirical fact. And it's not just, a kind of side effect of us being separate beings, but it's instead, this kind of deep bond that we share with each other, so that even the probably different members of the group, of the Ripodon Society, all, no matter what, you can feel, particularly once Kevin turns and becomes the most kind of like enthusiastic evangelist of the Ripodon Society in some ways, the most serious evangelist of the Ripodon Society. And enthusiasm, of course, means to be filled with the Spirit of God, enthusiasm. That no matter their differences and no matter their jibings, they're actually all sort of stations of one mind. And even though Fat is the one who sort of receives the downloads, Fat is also kind of recognized to be a fictional character by all of them, except for, of course, himself. So that's the kerygma that, Dick wants us to explore the nature of identity as an informational being, and to see that we can begin to engage in acts of ultra metacognition, as he does, in writing about Horse Lover Fat for, quote, and I believe this is page 11 of the vintage volume, the first chapter. I am Horse Lover Fat, and I'm writing this in the third person to gain much needed objectivity, right? That Phil is recognizing that there's this other attribute of himself called Horse Lover Fat, who every night writes the exegesis. And that even Phil is kind of puzzled at the sheer amount of the exegesis and the, as the psychologist would say, cathection onto the kind of like deep attachment, libidinal attachment even, towards this project of like trying to figure it out, all caps, right? And trying to grapple with that ridiculous question, which is why, why is it like this, rather than just that it is like this. And that he's modeling for us, therefore, an enterprise that we can ourselves engage in, which is to observe that, in fact, we are ourselves spaces of awareness, right? We are not primarily selves. We're spaces of awareness out of which different forms of self manifest as instances. There's the Phil self, there's the horse lover fat self, there's the Philip K. Dick self, right? There's the Mobius self that manifests on Monday nights and gets into a kind of trance state. All the words flow through him. And there's the kind of like, you know, rich self that is sort of puzzled sometimes at just like what it is this Mobius character is saying. And that you can then go back to the recordings and watch them like holotapes in order to experience much needed objectivity. And that this practice is a kind of, you know, what Ernst Junger called, you know, psychonautics. It's a exploration of the nature of our own psyche and the possibility of the different states that it can inhabit. So I think it's deeply healthy to do this. As a culture, we tend to frown upon it and want us to be kind of like Humpty Dumpty, you know, mean what we say and say what we mean, rather than explore the space of all possible selves that we are. But if we watch Phil watching Horse Lover Fat, we might get into a space where we're able to discern the fact that different forms of our own self show up at different domains on an everyday basis. And that's not a kind of sign of psychosis, right? But is a sign of the deeply fecund, right, fertile aspect of our awareness, where in reaction to different contexts, it produces different forms of ourselves. But who is the one who observes all of them, right? And if we can begin to practice looking to see who it is who observes all of them, then, you know, we might be Buddhas without knowing it, you know, as I think it is Phil writes about Horse Lover Fat, that we may have experienced, you know, something like diamond mind, where we can observe what our true nature is, rather than getting caught up in these kind of partial instances of ourselves and thinking that they're so, right? So that's Kerygma. That's part one, and it's under the title, I think if you want to put it up there, Does Synchronicity Music Go Deedle Deedle Queep, right? Yeah, that's 1A. Yeah, there you go. So synchronicity music is, of course, the music created by Minnie that puts viewers into a kind of trance, and which has nothing to do with really the meaning of what is being said, but is firing on a kind of non-semantic register. And one of those non-semantic registers would be agape, would be love. We experience this kind of profound continuity with each other, which forms, you know, the kind of bonds of community that we can all share, that I feel, you know, that I feel like we share on here as a collective. And that Phil will say, so if we look, if we could look at some of those pages we have up there and then maybe go to some questions, Jeremy, you know, one of the, might be the one with the beer in it, I'm not sure. Let's see. Yeah, it's over on the right-hand side. Cool. That's great, 135. I'll read from the vintage. In my opinion, Kevin may go deedle deedle queep whenever Fat reads or quotes from his tractate, where the tractate is, of course, a kind of fictional representation of the exegesis. I think it's very interesting that it's not really the exegesis. The exegesis is this, you know, much greater bulk of a text, and that the tractate is this kind of representation of the exegesis. Kevin may go deedle deedle queep whenever Fat reads or quotes from his tractate, but Fat is on to something. In other words, there may be an element of noise making here and hand waving, but Fat sees a cosmic phagocytosis in progress, one in which in each one in which each microform we are each involved. A toxic particle is lodged in each of us. That which is above the microcosm is that which is below the macrocosm, our man. So that toxic particle, I would suggest to you, that is lodged in each of us is the same as the toxic particle that is lodged in horse liver fat. It's this sense of being an I. It's the sense of being a localized being that could be fired into by a pink light, that being somehow separate enough to be invaded by God, as opposed to being a being that is always already infused by God, infused by the divine, infused by VALIS, infused by the cosmic sentience that we all are. So maybe that's an occasion for some comments or questions, but to me, that's really, in a non-religious, non-spiritual even way, what I would take to be the kernel of PKD's informational Gnosticism, where we're engaged in this project of self-knowledge through reflecting on our nature with texts like the tractate and the exegesis, and that as we do that, we become capable of experiencing a more profound basis to our identity than our localized self in space and time.
Well, excellent, Rich. So we do have some interesting comments here as we've been going along, and maybe I can find the one that actually mentioned this quote. Let's see if I can locate that. Well, here's an interesting one, because it's about this too, the tractate, right? So Dan's saying, why did Dick decide to polish the selections from the exegesis? Many of the paratexts would have been more effective if they had been rougher, more spontaneous, showing evidence of real scribbling. So sort of an question there. Yeah.
See, I think, so this is part of my experience, okay, of reading VALIS. As soon as I read VALIS for the first time in, I believe, the late 1980s, it created in me this deep desire to see the exegesis and find the exegesis, because there's something radically incomplete about the tractate. And that polish, I agree with you, there's both a kind of non sequitur quality to the tractate as it's presented in VALIS. In other words, one thing doesn't really follow after another in a kind of logical or narrative way. And also that it doesn't, as you say, Dan, have this kind of, personal touch. Like, it doesn't seem like a seismograph of Fat's writing. Now, part of it, I guess, would be the constraints of publishing that Russ Galen, who of course shows up in this book as Dick's agent, and who is, okay, I think Phil says he's okay, was kind of, I think it's pretty clear from my brief interactions with Galen over email, but also through other things that I've read, that he was dubious about the quality of this informational Gnosticism that Dick was offering. So I think it's really interesting that, Dick saw that people would think that this was cray, right? Because Horse Lover Fat and Phil and Kevin and David show up to Sonoma and they think Eric Lambton and Linda Lambton are crazy, right? So he was not unaware of the fact that this was going to seem, borderline psychotic. But I think that that helps us contextualize why the tractate is so kind of, I guess I would say, enigmatic in the text, that it sort of refuses, to me anyway, our interpretation in a way that the exegesis does not. The exegesis is actually, to me, does a far better job contextualizing what these entries are. And then these entries, and here's the clue, Dan, I think, really only become legible with the decoder ring of the exegesis. that it's only once you've found the exegesis and you start reading the exegesis that you can go back and read VALIS and go, oh, this is making a kind of deep metacognitive sense in a way that it did not to me before. The first few times that I read VALIS, I was both deeply affected by it, and also I would stick my fingers in my ears and cover my eyes and go blah, 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 every time the Christianity would come up, because I personally found it kind of indigestible. I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't have this in my background. I wasn't interested in it. It seemed like it was antithetical to my worldview as it existed. But because it's so enigmatic, it's almost like they're, the way in which lacunae work in these kind of like the Nag Hammadi, Nag Hammadi text, which Dick was, of course, fascinated by, these long buried texts that are then dug up in Egypt, and they have holes in them. And the holes in them are called lacunae. They're gaps. And I feel like the distillations, the fake distillations of the exegesis point to the real thing. They make you want to go to the real thing, that the tractate is literally fake exegesis. I wouldn't even say that it's polished. I would say it's only pretending to be exegesis. It's android exegesis, right? It's simulacrum exegesis. And then it made me at least think, gosh, I wonder what the exegesis says. And then, of course, there's a brief, we'll go a little bit more over the publication history of the exegesis next week. But, there's a bit of it that Paul Williams puts together in a small press production of not enough copies, which now go for some extraordinary price on eBay. And then there's selections of it released in the Selected Literary and Philosophical Writings. Again, so we're getting dribs and drabs of the exegesis. And for somebody like myself, that just made me want the whole thing, right? It made me feel like, what else is there? Like if it's 8,000 plus pages long, what does it even mean to extract, 50 pages, 100 pages, or fragments in the tractate? So in a long, roundabout way, to me, this is the response I've come to have about why the tractate is of the sort that it is in VALIS, Dan, which is that it's really a kind of impetus to read the exegesis. And so I would suggest that, in fact, VALIS is a text, designed to bring us to the exegesis. It's a kind of cosmic breadcrumb to the exegesis. Now, of course, there are parts of the exegesis where we can read and wonder if Dick even wanted the exegesis published. But there are other places where it seems very clear that he did, or at least wanted it to be read. It's kind of odd to imagine a very, very long text like this, 8,000 plus pages, that the author does not want anybody to read. So that's why I think, and I think you're right, that they're not as, the passages of the tractate aren't as captivating and useful as they could be, precisely because they're kind of left decontextualized relatively and as pointers to the exegesis, a way of proliferating the exegesis. And so that allows me to make another claim, which is that I want to suggest that we think about Fat as a character, not of VALIS, but of the exegesis itself. That Fat is actually a character that is generated by Dick's nightly writing of the exegesis, because this experience is so extraordinary. I mean, how many human beings in history have experienced the effect of writing this much about a single topic, about a single instance, really? And we've talked in the past about the way in which Dick's writing is often about the feedback loop that the writing creates with the reader and with the writer. That a writer writes something, is affected by the writing of it, and then writes more of it based on being affected by it. This is the premise even of Man in the High Castle, where Hawthorne Abbotson writes some of Grasshopper Lies Heavy with the help of the I Ching, continues to consult the write the I Ching, and is puzzled by what he himself has written. So that's my sense anyway. And I think it's worth saying that I don't think, and I'd wonder what the crew has to say about this. I don't think that VALIS is in many ways, nearly as satisfying or enjoyable or kind of dazzling of a novel as Scanner Darkly or Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch or Ubik, but that there's a depth to it that is pointing to something else. And so it's almost like one of these pop songs that will get discussed in Radio Free Albemuth, where there's a pop song that, or in VALIS itself, that harbors this kind of secret message in it that is not really quite subliminal, but is designed to induce collective awakening, designed to induce collective awareness. And so I think that VALIS is kind of a fake novel, actually. It's only pretending to be a novel. And in that sense, it's a little bit less satisfying in ways than Palmer Eldritch, the Three Stigmata Palmer Eldritch, or Ubik, or Scanner, or a novel like Time Out of Joint, or Martian Time Slip. There's so many great ones, but that it's pointing to something else, and that what it's pointing to is it's spreading the exegesis.
So one of the interesting questions that came up was actually talking about it as well, but then also the idea that, if I can find it, someone was commenting that VALIS itself is a way to kind of spread the exegesis, right? And Horse Lover Fat and the Tractate are kind of dictated by the exegesis, the kind of invention of the exegesis.
Yes.
So that's very interesting. And Erica was mentioning, PKD immortalizes us in VALIS, kind of like receiving a knighthood, our commission, heaven on earth, and to kill the empire by phagocytasis. Please define this process. And I think you went into that a little bit, but it's an interesting angle there from this idea that it's a kind of an initiatory book, and in many ways the other books were as well. But I think VALIS, if you're reading PKD and you eventually come to VALIS, something different happens. Like you said, it's not a straightforward novel with an easily identifiable character, because the character is sort of a fabrication of themselves and of the author, especially that one line when he starts going into, I am Horse Lover Fat, and then another line where he just straight up introduces a Scanner Darkly.
Yes.
Right in the novel and quotes it. And I was assuming he would use a pseudonym for it, a reference, and it's sort of something like
my novel, Scanner Darkly.
So that just like broke the fourth wall, right? So there's something different going on with this novel, and that it's a novel, but it's like pretending to be a novel. You're very aware that it is a Horse Lover Fat of a novel, But sorry, I kind of diverged from Erica's question.
No, that's beautiful, because what we can feel there in that, like to describe this initiatory process, I think, is why I have talked about the course as a course in practices of ultra Meta-Cognition. And I think that the initiatory practice is that if you'll read this book and you'll observe the effects of this book on you, one of the things that you will observe is that it produces a desire to interact with the exegesis. And in producing this desire to interact with the exegesis, it's training us in practices of ultra Meta-Cognition. So the phagocytosis, in fact, if we want to break out of the black iron prison, as it were, the black iron prison is nothing but the prison of the eye, right? In other words, the prison of the eye, which, we discussed last week, institutions as that equal sign, that which blocks ultra Meta-Cognition, right? That which gives us an answer to what our identity is. It gives an answer to the question, who am I? That we then attach to. And in that attachment, we ossify and slowly die because we're developmental creatures, we're processes, we're beings of information, and we're not beings of identity, which is a kind of strange cage to put a living system in. And so I think the initiatory practice is the initiation into practicing over and over this experience, this inkling of ultra metacognition, where, like Phil, we engage in this practice of much needed objectivity, and we turn our awareness around and say, okay, who exactly is this guy, Jeremy? Like, I'm going to just observe this guy, Jeremy, who seems to manifest each Monday and do like a really awesome job, engaging in esoteric dialogue concerning the informational gnosis of Philip K. Dick. And where did that guy come from? Right? Could I have ever predicted the emergence of this guy, Jeremy, from this field of awareness that I have been, all along? And when we engage in that process, then we engage in a little bit of kind of play with the space of identity that we are afforded by the kind of biological experience that we all have. We all have a way more expansive capacity for identity than we actually live in. So the initiatory practice and the healing of the phagocytosis, the disarming of the toxic particle lodged in each of us, the antidote to the toxic particle, is this process of engaging in, what Ramana Maharshi will call Atma Vichara, the self-inquiry. Who am I? Where is my body? Right? As Phil will say at a certain point, he's like, I think it's Phil. He says, that means my body is nowhere at all. and what he means by that, I think, is that our usual habit of experiencing our bodies as sort of congealed in space-time is just that, a habit. That in fact, our bodies are ongoing developmental flows of energy and information. They're not ossified things separated in space and time. And that when we experience ourselves as an ossified thing experienced in space and time, then we experience ourselves as a being that could die, as a localized identity. Only a being with identity could die, right? But if we are able to release the throttling embrace of the self, as Huxley called it, then we can observe the way in which horse lover fat is coming into being and going out of being. Jeremy is coming into being and going out of being. Mobius is coming into being and going out of being. But look, still, awareness remains, right? So Dick was not obsessed with, but he loved Ecclesiastes, right? He names the grasshopper lies heavy after a passage in Ecclesiastes. And Ecclesiastes teaches us to just observe, hey, look, vanity of vanity is always vanity. Everything comes into being and goes out of being. But there's something left that can perceive that. And we can be initiated by ourselves, not by anybody else, ourselves, into the opportunity of just observing that and not identifying with those impermanent aspects of ourselves. And when we don't identify with those impermanent aspects of ourselves, we experience something like liberation. We experience something even like, resurrection. Because there is no death for a being without identity. There's just awareness. Who would die? Next question.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you, Rich. So let's see. What's a good one here? Good follow-up. Maybe a little bit more about Phil. William is mentioning that PKD's split with Ursula was over VALIS and Le Guin, who recently passed away. But Le Guin is very famous for noting that, Philip K. Dick should be on the bookshelves next to Charles Dickens in Western literature, right? So she had a reverence for him. Yeah, she had a reverence for him, but she also was more critical of some of his works. And so William saying that she thought that Phil's work had degraded, and this scared Phil. And upon reflection, Phil rallied his confidence and deduced correctly that Le Guin had wrote from an entitled perspective and could not relate to the punishing power of true Gnostic revelation. It's an interesting take. I haven't read all of the exegesis, so I'm not sure.
Well, those letters, those letters with Ursula are in the exegesis, and William's observation is fascinating because you can imagine, right, that no matter how already in VALIS, Phil was represented as, quote, a famous science fiction writer, which he was at that point, right? But writing is a deeply vulnerable act, and you can imagine the blow that would be to feel that somebody for whom you had such respect, like Ursula Le Guin, thought that the work had degraded, and you would have these doubts. But this idea that, in fact, well, don't criticize what you don't understand, Dylan, right? That if you'll read these books, strangely enough, and stay with them, I do think you go through a similar kind of ordeal as PK did. I don't think it just selects for people who go through this ordeal. I was deeply skeptical and critical of and actively deconstructing the informatic Gnosticism of PKD's work when I first started reading it, because I saw it as kind of a piece with the reductionist model of biology that I saw in the Ascent in the life sciences. But what I didn't understand is that you have to actually go through the experience. And if you go through the experience in a first-person sense, it's not reductionist. Just as there may be something reductionist about the chemistry that describes LSD-25, but the experience of LSD-25, assuming you're not in a category of person who shouldn't engage in those things because you're bipolar or have a history of mental illness in your family, is not a self-reductionist, right? That it's something that has to be gone through in order to be understood, or even grokked, as Heinlein would have said. So I think that insight that Will is making is a fascinating one, because we can really feel for Phil, like, trying to put the ineffable into words, which he's trying to do, right? He's trying to F the ineffable, as Alan Watts would put it. And to have your powers doubted by, a friend and, great writer for whom you had enormous respect would be a blow. And then you would indeed have to rally your confidence, wouldn't you? But that rallying of the confidence might have made the book better. Like it takes courage, I think, personally, to write a book like VALIS. Knowing that you already have all this success, you could stop, You don't need to tell the story of VALIS. You don't need to narrate the pink light. Probably most human beings in history who have had mystical inklings of any kind have not shared and not sought to put into language those revelations. And maybe they're wise, maybe they're wiser than those of us who find the urge to somehow share it in language. But it doesn't feel like it. It feels like, at least for us, among whom I would humbly include myself, that it's a beautiful experience to just try to point and say, wow, doesn't seem like reality is what it seems to be, is it? And that it may be way, way better than you thought. And you might want to think about that. It might be that this suffering that we're experiencing is optional, and that, in fact, we're all kind of deeply blessed as, fields of awareness who just mistake ourselves momentarily. We perform a cognitive error and think that we're these individual beings when, in fact, we're stations in one mind.
Yeah, so William's quoting something about Ursula from the exegesis. And I think I've actually come
Is this
across
William
this.
Sorrell?
This is William Klaus.
Oh, great.
Yeah,
Awesome.
yeah. But it's quoting Philip K. Dick, that Ursula should regard my moment of failure as the moment of my greatest success shows me that it is possible for an intelligent, educated adult to enjoy the prison of atomization we are in. After all, if all you ever experience is yourself, you're constantly safe. I think safety is the summum bonum for Ursula. And it's interesting because what you're saying, is like, and everything in VALIS is that this experience, the religious experience of horse lover fat, aka Philip K. Dick, was shattering. That either God came too late or too early for horse lover fat, and it's this shattering experience of divine revelation or theophany or gnosis that I think is really important, just from a kind of a religious studies point of view. Like, these things aren't necessarily like moments of clarity. They can be moments of deep dread, like Muhammad seeing the angel Gabriel come to him in a cave and sobbing like a child in his wife's lap. I mean, that certainly doesn't seem like a moment of triumph, but it's certainly a theophany, right? So I think, again, Philip K. Dick, like you're saying, he's bringing that human element to this experience, and he's doing it through literature. So in some ways, I don't know what Ursula would have thought after. I don't know if she knew about these experiences or
I think she did. Yeah,
she did. Okay,
I think so. From reading the exegesis.
Yeah, I just don't know. Given it time and given the full exegesis, it makes a lot more sense, and I think we can appreciate it in retrospect. Maybe at the time, as like two sci-fi authors kind of sharing letters, it was a little different. But, but yeah, I just think he's coming from a different angle, like you're saying, about the sort of getting this ego dissolution experience, right? When all you ever experience is yourself, that you can't relate to what I went, So I feel like that's what he's very much saying there. So yeah.
Right. So the shattering, I think you're right. So it's only from the perspective of an identity that it is shattering, because an identity thinks that it's a fixed, form. Whereas, what we're being asked to imagine ourselves is flows of information. And so, on the other side of the shatter is a flow, right? It's all, like that. It was just a wrong map of who we are. If we can experience ego death, then this map is inadequate and needs to be let go of in order to really map our experience. And that's where, again, I'm going to loop it back to this apparent evolutionary imperative in which we're living right now, where the feedback loop between ourselves and our environment that occurs when we treat ourselves as these atomized individuals, to quote from the quote that Will was pointing to there, is really inescapable now, right? We can't deny, like we want to say, oh, fossil fuels are the problem. The real problem, the root of the problem, is this atomized sense of being. And until we kind of transcend and, ultra metacognize that apparent atomized sense of being, then there's not going to be any solution for, the ongoing lethal presence of human beings in this ecosystem. It's just for each other and for the ecosystem itself. The good news is that it's not very complicated. The kernel of the teaching is very, and Dick says, if we go to another page, Jeremy, where I think it's probably the third one, it's where it says Shankara. No, maybe it's the beard one. Yeah, there it is. Shankara and Eckhart, the same person, living in two places and two times. Well, not quite, actually. That who's being referred to there is, oh, wow, cramp. Cramp from Lotus.
Oh,
no. What's being referred to there is Meister Eckhart, 14th century Rhineland mystic, who Eric Lampton says is the first person to conceptualize the Godhead as distinct from God, where the Godhead would be more like VALIS and less like an entity. And Shankara, the early synthesizer of Vedanta, the same person living in two places at two different times. Well, not really, right? That in fact, there's just one impetus that takes on the name Shankara and takes on the name Eckhart, not saying that they remember each other, but that there is this impetus in the universe that's trying to realize truth. And that the Friends of God and the Ripperton Society have both come to this perspective that I call in the afterword the perennial philosophy. So Eckhart and Shankara are both kind of, emblematic of the perennial philosophy that says, one, appearance is not reality. Two, it's possible for human beings to know through self-inspection that appearance is not reality. Three, that it's possible to know this not just by inference, but by direct knowledge. And four, four, that we have a double aspect to our nature. There's the phenomenal ego, so horse, lover, fat, or Phil, and the big self, which is the mind, of which those are just stations of awareness. And five, that the purpose of human life is to realize this. And that VALIS, initiates us and features a series of characters initiated into that quest, for self-knowledge. And that it's an amazing quest, to be on. So, I think we should, give thanks for Phil's courage anyway in persisting there, because that would be difficult to deal with. And he really would, as Will put it nicely, have to, rally confidence. So thank you for that, Will.
Yeah, so Ada from Facebook is mentioning that I think the trilogy as a whole is greater than the parts. Having read and listened to it several times, it seems to transmit an informational gnosis that is beyond that granted by any individual element. So maybe that could be a future class, reading the VALIS trilogy. I think that'd be kind of fun. Maybe not. Maybe a little later this year.
No, I love the idea, and then so I just want to kind of get here. We got VALIS, right? We got Divine Invasion. We got Radio Free Albemuth, and in a way, we have Transmigration of Timothy Archer because it's got Thomas in it. So, no, I agree, and that's what I keep pointing to, is that there's something about reading these books together, that each book is more than the sum of its parts, and then all the books together are more than the sum of its parts, because it engages us in this process, and we become better and better at tuning into this informational gnosis. And that's why I called it, in the first couple of weeks, programming and metaprogramming the human biocomputer, where we really start to feed back on and investigate the nature of our own awareness in a way that is really very healing and does not require, it works well with meditation, does not require or even necessarily encourage psychedelics. The two seem to go together demographically, when it seems to be the case that the demographic of readers are, could be characterized in terms of cannabis and psychedelics being kind of allies. And that's worth meditating on and not disparaging, actually. But I do think that it's important to realize, too, just the way in which these books themselves are alterations of consciousness. And that you're quite right, when we read them together, that they do something else than when they're just read apart. Even the sequence we've done in this class, I think, does something, for me anyway, that is extraordinary. The Bob Arctur Fred conjunction really sets up nicely the Phil horse lover fat conjunction, and they are mutually illuminating for each other.
So I just wanted to also mention William Sarrell is viewing from Facebook.
Awesome.
He said, thanks for the shout out, Rich. And I completely agree that VALIS is not a novel, or at least not a very good one. The first half is a Gnostic autobiography and some of the best writing Phil had ever done at that point. And the fictional part of the book that follows, he says, is a letdown. So it's kind of an interesting way of thinking about the book. There's a sort of autobiographical element, and then it kind of moves. There's a switch which is really exciting when the switch happens into, you know, okay, here's these like rock stars in this film, and
Kevin.
You know, Kevin, and here's this whole other element, and then Sophia. So they're the kind of internal work that Phil was working with suddenly becomes externalized into a science fiction story. So, and then there's a kind of a letdown with the loss of Sophia, you know. So there's a kind of interesting trajectory of the novel itself, where it's sort of starting with Phil, starting with autobiography, switching into a kind of fictional narrative. Like, okay, this is a sci-fi book. Let's go on the sci-fi track a little bit. But at the same time, that part also breaks more narratives too, because Sophia helps you heal, as somebody was mentioning in the comments, helps heal Horse Liver Fat. Realize this is just a fiction, you know. You're Phil Dick, and then
Horse Liver Fat is healed when he disappears.
Yeah, he disappears. Yeah, so the elements certainly travel through the book, but I think he has a good point that just the structure of the book itself is kind of interesting and weird. It's like I don't know. It's just sort of using the elements of a science fiction novel, but not really, you know.
In order to propagate the Gnostic autobiography.
Yeah.
Right. It's a kind of, you know, plasmate, you know, cross-bonded with itself.
That's a great point, because it is a kind of symbiotic thing. Yeah.
Yes. And it gets it to circulate, because, like, you know, because this remains an issue in the kind of sci-fi community today about Dick's work. People are like, there's a kind of uncertainty about the relationship to the VALIS work. You know, just give me some of that good sci-fi. So, you know, the second half, it gives you some sci-fi, but, you know, at least in Williams' perspective, it's a little half-hearted. I kind of like it. I mean, I love the relation between the members of the Ripodon Society. And I think that just sort of straightforward overall arc of the narrative of the attempt to deal with two dead girls, you know, almost has something Twin Peaks about it, you know, that there's a kind of dead girl that makes the whole narrative go. And that, you know, that's not a sacrificial logic, but a logic of grief. And, you know, Phil himself points out in the exegesis and elsewhere that, you know, some of this work is out of deep grief for his loss of his twin sister, right? Who loses very early in life. So, you know, seeing that, you know, that as part of the Gnostic autobiography, that grieving of the dead girl, you know, I mean, I think helps situate some of that sci-fi a little, you know, the sci-fi later part. But that's a very useful perspective on the book, William. Thank you.
Yeah, and just getting a comment from Jen that she's loving the read-along photo situation, the book. I'm liking this too, because as we speak, Facebook is just blasting Philip K. Dick text in our little video bubbles, but here is just the first thing you see will be a page from VALIS.
That's awesome.
Facebook. So this is great. This is a kind of one of those radical acts of reading, right, on the internet that we're talking about.
Well, this is what's so interesting. So yeah, let's read from what Kevin says about Meister Eckhart. So he said he was the first person to conceive of the Godhead in distinction to God. I don't think that that's quite true, but possibly in the Christian tradition. The greatest of the Christian mystics, he taught that a person can attain union with the Godhead, as did Ruysbroeck and many others. He taught that a person can attain union with the Godhead. He held a concept that God exists within the human soul, ! And to me, what's fascinating about that is the idea that there's any controversy about that at all, since it's completely in the book of Luke. Luke 17:21 tells us this, but we find it so impossible to fathom a non-dual God in a dualist society based on this atomization that we can't accept the fact that, you know, if God is, and that's sort of like saying if is, then God is within us. And that VALIS is very much a book about coming to terms with the idea that God is not some sort of external entity that could invade us, but is instead and aspects of ourselves that we can explore with the aid of our imaginations, and that our imaginations are a kind of prime theological tool that we should use. And here, Dick is in a continuum with, the great British poet and engraver William Blake, right? Which if we could go back in time, it would be great to get Blake to do engravings of PKD's VALIS experience to go alongside Crumb's beautiful ones, right? And so it's odd that this is controversial at all from an experiential point of view, that we can reach, that we can merge with God. We have a spark of some kind that isn't created Brahman. That's why Zebra, VALIS, right? That we can experience ourselves as soon as we lose that sense of separation, as soon as there's no boundary between ourselves and the universe, or that which brings the universe into being, the Godhead, then where else would God be? God, like this whole idea of God being some external entity, is a mind trick that we play on ourselves because of our tendency to, create narratives with agents and actions in time. Thank you. So beautiful. I wanted to turn to one more thing and then maybe go to some more questions, and that I wanted to sort of confess in a glorious way that the way in which I've found myself experiencing and conceptualizing this webinar itself is a kind of combination of the sort of stoner discourse in Scanner Darkly and the endless collective exegesis of the characters of the Ripodon Society. That part of what I really love about VALIS, even in its, in its imperfections, and which I love about the stoner discourse of Scanner Darkly, is this kind of is this modeling of a kind of collective dialogue that we can engage in, where we don't have to set ourselves, like where we can disagree and we can even rib each other, and we can have a sense of humor, and we can have radical doubt about any of it, but that it's not kind of vouchsafed by any institution. It's not, it doesn't have the signature of any authority or church, but is instead the sort of just sheer joy of engaging in exegesis itself. And so that it was wonderful to sort of read the repartee between Fat and Kevin and others as sort of a kind of funny cosmic breadcrumb for what we're all doing here, in fact, which is just sort of not, something, a kind of transcendental spitballing on the nature of reality as revealed by the novels of Philip K. Dick. So I'm happy that we're continuing that tradition, which one can imagine could have died out in the 1970s, but hasn't. So more stoner discourse, please.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. This weekend, I found myself in a situation while reading VALIS, having brunch, and in a state of distraction, suddenly hearing that my wife was talking about the logos with somebody at the and I did a kind of like, what is happening here? What is really happening in this moment? Why am I hearing a discussion about the logos? So I agree that the
logos discourse enjoys talking about itself.
Yeah,
it's trying to talk about itself. That's what we are. Is the logos trying to talk about itself? So, of course, you're going to overhear your wife talking about the logos, and that is part of the sort of beautiful, and I hope not panicky, sort of experience of synchronicities that can start to happen when a collective of people all start reading these books together. Because it's a little bit like what happens at the beginning of Scanner Darkly, when Charles Freck starts to see the aphids too, right? That when we're all tuning our imaginations in this way, there's this uncanny way in which reality seems to mirror our kind of collective imaginary investigation. And this kind of is what I think Jung called, active imagination, right? That we engage in the investigation of the archetypical nature of our own experience through this not passive act of imagination, but active imagination. So, and that, I think it's David, our eyes might glaze over sometimes as we kind of go into a trance and we find a kind of possibly mad God overtaking us, But that's the very description of love as it's detailed in the Phaedrus by Plato, that love is a kind of divine madness that overtakes us. And that, we, as we collectively read these books, are engaging in that kind of love.
Yeah, that's quite beautiful. So maybe to riff a little bit more on the twinning aspect of this, Tessa was actually mentioning that this may have to do again with something autobiographical, because apparently he couldn't see two of his daughters. His previous ex-wives wouldn't let him. So there's a kind of a loss with the two twin daughters and not being able to see them. So I think that's interesting layer there.
Again, can you imagine, or he mentions, I think, in the book, being worried about Beth not letting him see Christopher, that he's not going to be able to get access to Christopher, and that kind of loss of that contact gets manifested in it. That's a kind of heartrending story, but it's the nature of family sometimes that it would work that way.
Tessa's clearing the air. She's mentioning that Tessa. She's clearing the air. She's saying, "Oh, he saw Christopher all the time. The boy needs." I knew that.
Yeah, I'm glad, but in the book, he talks about being afraid of not being able to, or Fat talks about being afraid of not seeing him, and I think we can all identify with that.
Yeah. Let's see if there's any more questions from the Facebook chat, because we're getting quite a few on Facebook now. Yeah, interesting. Lindsay's mentioning that within the book. I'd have to reread a little closely when it moves into the sci-fi part. But Lindsay's saying in the switch, Philip K. Dick starts describing the character's clothes and looks more. And maybe that has to do with the kind of more fantastical nature of the latter half of the book, just the kind of super reality of the latter half of the book with the kind of rock star sort of sci-fi thing going on.
Sonoma.
Yeah. The Sonoma phase. So, but yeah, that's a very interesting observation too, in the kind of, I don't know.
It would be good to put next to the Ubik material, where of course the wardrobe is outlandish and uncanny.
Yes, that's for sure. Let's see.
Yeah, I'm walking around my house right now to get something else to drink.
Oh, it's all good.
In the honor of stoner discourse.
Yeah, Lindsay's also saying that Dick points to his sanity by his conversation with Kevin about the film VALIS and how they are just using science fiction as a means to context, to connect the context of these spiritual ideas. That's the book VALIS itself. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Sorry.
No. It's pointing to itself as an act of ultra metacognition. It's saying, look, exactly. I'm pointing to what I am, which is something pretending to be science fiction in order to traffic in these ideas.
You kind of wonder what he would have done if he had lived, into early 90s, and what he would have used science fiction for, like how his writing would have evolved to continue to, like, would there be more semi-autobiographical experimental novels? Would they kind of transmute back into the pulp science fiction that people loved and wanted more of, but do something even more subversive with that? Interesting questions. But
I mean, it's totally speculative, but what I really I have some kind of a strong impression that it would go that the work on the exegesis would create a kind of desire to distill all of that in a crystalline form and that would push him in an almost kind of Joycean direction, where he would start like playing with poetics. Like Phil complains in VALIS that he can't write poetry worth a damn, even though he's tried. But I have a feeling that, if that massive bulk of the exegesis did anything, it would create this desire to kind of write shorter and shorter pieces, and that might kind of manifest in wordplay and poetry. But who knows, he would have needed to keep paying the bills. So one thing we can be sure of in poetry in 1982, it wouldn't have paid the bills.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you never know, because he started to get successful with the film, right?
Yeah.
And started to see money from it. So maybe he could have went, all right, I've got the financial cushion. Let me go start exploring and indulging in my own kind of in poetry or something to that degree.
Could be.
But just to switch to some more questions, Marston's saying that, yeah, the VALIS movie is a book for the reader, and it is a recall of Man from the High Castle, the most successful novel. It was based on the David Bowie movie, The Man Who Fell from Earth.
Nicholas Ray.
Yeah. That's interesting. And
yeah,
then somebody's asking, sorry.
I believe that was his favorite movie.
Isn't that interesting? And that's a very Gnostic movie too, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. David Bowie watching 25 different televisions at the same time.
Yeah, I think William Irwin Thompson has a whole riff on that in one of his earlier books, just talking about the Gnosticism of the man who fell to earth and the kind of forgetting, of his sort of alien origins and sort of getting stuck on planet Earth. But William Klaus is asking, did Phil ever express that zebra derived from the lines of the hexagram in the I Ching?
Oh, that's so funny. I've wondered that myself, actually. The references that I'm familiar with, and maybe Tessa would jump in, but it's always, in reference to this idea of mimicry and camouflage. But that the I Ching itself, of course, does look like those stripes. And how could he have not noticed that?
Yeah. So it was like interesting. Dan's just saying, it seems like the externalized internal dialogue between PKD and FAT and VALIS is modeling the process that leads to metacognition and ultra metacognition. Well said. Well said.
Yes.
And yeah, Tessa also mentioned what we read in VALIS, that with zebra he was thinking of camouflage, but it's interesting. Oh, and Brian Eno, the songwriter, was the basis for the Friends of the rock star. He says he read. This is Jim's mentioned. Yeah, that's funny. Interesting autobiographies. I mean, with any novel, there's an element of creative autobiography, transmuting reality into fiction and then back. But interesting. Yeah, and I was going to mention too, the last thing just about Ursula K. Le Guin and Philip K. Dick. I think they were coming from very different orientations in terms of their mysticism. Because, anybody who's read Ursula knows that she's sort of a deeply Taoist, anarchic, mystical writer. But Phil was very rooted in the Christian tradition, kind of Gnostic Christianity. He was obsessive about it. So I think they were just coming from different angles. So perhaps, VALIS for Le Guin wasn't as interesting as it is a theophany for somebody from that kind of deep Christian gnosis,
But see, that's what's so interesting about the page we have up here. He said, Sankara in India in the 9th century, he taught the same things Eckhart taught. It's a trans-Christian mysticism in which man can reach beyond God or merges with God or with a spark of some kind that isn't created. Brahman, that's why zebra. In other words, that it's true that the refrain is a Christian one. And I think it's interesting in the book that Phil reflects on the fact that, there's some Quaker background there. And the Quakers, of course, have this concept of the inner light. But it's a deeply perennialist perspective. The exegesis is drawing on a lot of Taoism, right? But it's true, the language of Christ and the language of the resurrection is, has a particular kind of effect, and it makes people uncomfortable. I know it made me uncomfortable when I first started reading the work, but it's been part of my kind of process of understanding that I had a deeply flawed perspective on what Christianity was because of the way in which it's been institutionalized in our culture. So PKD's fascination with the early Christians is really a kind of, I think Gabriel McKee writes about this very well, kind of anarchic, relationship to non-institutional, pre-institutional Christianity, and that those, forms, those Valentinian forms were forms of groups, right? Where people.
Oh, I think we lost Rich. He'll pop back in, I'm sure, in a moment. So why don't we take some more questions while we're waiting? Let me make sure I have the chat saved for everybody. Yeah, William, McLuhan was a devout Catholic, which always seemed odd, converted later in life, I believe. I didn't know that was later in life. Didn't realize that was something he came to. I thought that was more. But yeah, McLuhan is somebody worth checking out. Maybe we can do a read of that together. The medium is the message. Or just kind of do a get-together about the McLuhan's Playboy interview, which is kind of a thing in itself. He mentions Teilhard. Okay, converted at age 26, so as an adult. Very interesting. Oh, here is Rich. There you are. Oh, sorry, let me unmute you. Okay, there you go.
So I just think it's worth remembering that, that Dick's Christianity is a really, progressive one, and one that seems to reflect deeply on the non-institutionalized form of Christianity, where there's a structural reciprocity and equality between people who are engaged in self-inquiry, and it's, where women and men are both accepted, and that there's no hierarchical difference between and buffer between the priest and the parishioner, and there's a personal experience of not only revelation but of composition, of writing. That the early Gnostics were writers, and that more or less the kind of evidence that you had experienced Gnosis was that you offered your own composition, and that's what PKD is doing here.
So we're at about 90 minutes, but maybe we can do one or two more questions, and I feel like we could talk
for sure
hours about VALIS. But
yeah, I mean, I feel like I've been talking about it forever, and I'll never exhaust it.
Yeah, but here's an interesting one. Just they're connected. Somebody asked to define perennialism because they haven't heard of it before, but then another person asked about you, Rich, and after PKD, after he helped kind of open you up to Christianity, this kind of deeply progressive Gnostic Christianity, what do you consider yourself spiritually? You consider yourself perennialist?
I consider myself none. I'm a spiritual practitioner that seeks gnosis in all of its forms, and that at different periods of my life, different discourses seem to be more helpful than others, and that can change on a not only a daily basis, but on a minute by minute basis. But that the more I open myself to the biblical tradition, the more I see how powerful it is, and that it's powerful precisely because it's been misrecognized by our own culture. Once upon a time, I identified as Buddhist because I meditate every day, but I'm with the Friends of God and the Rippondan Society. That really there's no label that's really adequate to the ongoing experience of awakening that is available to us if we'll practice experiences of ultra Meta-Cognition. And I've just found that it's not helpful to label it in any way. When I teach a course on the intro to the Bible as literature, and I've written a book about the Bible, and I have a kind of profound reverence for the Bible, and it's a very powerful text that can really put us into states that I don't know that if you grew up in this culture, if other ones can necessarily for us. I feel like we have to sort of grapple with it because it's part of the landscape that we find ourselves living in. It's in every hotel room in America in one form or another. But yeah, I identify with all and none is the category that I would ascribe to myself. But I have been grateful for being able to be open to the aspects of Christianity that are enlivening.
So the other question was just about perennialism. And
yeah,
I think that would be a good thing to just refresh everybody with, because
sure.
that was a big part of your afterword in the issue.
Yeah, well, Huxley writes a book, 1943, The Perennial Philosophy, where if you think about the sheer chutzpah of that the world is at war. Huxley's leaving London for California, and the world is immersed in deep conflict. And Huxley is, has poor vision, but he's read an enormous amount. And he sees these deep patterns that connect to all of the world's spiritual traditions. And he writes an entire book about it, which draws mostly on non-Christian traditions in order to sort of bring those into relief. He's a little bit light on his Islamic references, but recognizes the Sufis as on the same page as Shankara and Meister Eckhart, for example. And Huxley is coming up with the term perennial philosophy in reference to the work of the German philosopher Leibniz, who supposedly first used it, but then there's some controversy about that. But the main idea is that the fundamental that all of the world religions, as Huxley put it, point to the same indescribable fact, or what he called the highest common factor. And that highest common factor, which is that A, appearance is not reality. B, we can know and not just deduce that appearance is not reality through self-inspection. And 3, when we engage in self-inspection, we see that we have 2 aspects to ourselves: the phenomenal egoic self and the deeper, larger self, which encompasses the all. And that 4, the goal of human life is to know this, that Huxley is going to say this experience is offered and repeated and is the core of all the world's religious traditions, bar none. Now, that can be a bit much to take, because all the world's religious traditions seem to all share one other factor, which is that they deny the other world's religious traditions. So, it would seem to be deeply counterintuitive that they were all have some highest common factor. But what this reframe, as the therapists might call it, reframing of religion allows us to do is to see that there are practices and techniques that we can gather from all of the different traditions, and that because each of us differs in temperament, we can find what works for us as a kind of spiritual cuisine, mixing, and borrowing from all the different traditions without feeling a need to be aligned with any particular institution. And I think that, a pretty clear implication of VALIS is that, institutions more or less exist as a way of trying to block human beings from this direct experience of the divine within them. And that the more narratives and tools that we can circulate that allow human beings to find on their own, doing it themselves, that in fact, they're beings of self-awareness, and that they are a way for the cosmos to know what it's like to be them, in a way. then the more those kind of like institutional forms that have, blocked our access to that self-knowledge and have, done so much in external reality and internal reality to kind of block the initiation of all of us in ultra metacognition, that those can start to fall away, but that we can give thanks for them because they've recorded all the discourses for us, right? We have all of the dharmas of all the traditions because these institutions existed and wrote them down and engraved them and created such enormous and beautiful works of art. But that it's time for us to realize that just as the bow and arrow was invented in innumerable contexts throughout the world, all for the same fundamental principle, so too was the capacity to experience in a kind of direct and first-person way the truth has manifested itself, has flowered in many different contexts, and that we ought to wonder why those contexts find themselves in kind of conflict with each other and who benefits from that conflict. When in fact, all of us as human beings have the kind of birthright and desire to link up with truth. And we all want to be happy and we all want to know the truth. And that if we know the truth, we're happy. And if we're happy, we know the truth. And it really is that simple. But what's simple but not easy is that each of us then needs to engage in the practices that call us. And that's what I find fascinating about PKD's work, that you have these novels that make people uneasy because people approach them almost as scripture, but not scripture because we believe in them, but because we recognize them as practice that allow us to transcend the limitations of the infrastructure of spirituality and religion as it's been bequeathed to us, even as we honor those traditions, even as we say, wow, Eckhart, wow, Shankara, but all and none. That I think, we've seen that, religion has had its chance. It's had its turn. And, even the Dalai Lama says it's failed. But what's left in the detritus, the trash in the gutter, as it were, is, here in this, sci-fi genre, we find, the possibility of some recipes for experiencing ultra metacognition, which is what we all are trying to experience, whether we know it or not.
Yeah, well articulated there. And I think that's something that 2 points you mentioned remind me of what Jeffrey Kripal talks about with, the human as two, right? Human as this sort of waking ego, and then the human as this indescribable divine aspect of the logos. So, or the mystery, or whatever you want to call it. And then he also
or just our imagination.
Or
not
just
to interrupt,
our imagination,
but yeah.
And then he also mentions the religion of no religion, which I think is an interesting subtitle to his book on Esalen and the kind of movement that brings a lot of these people. You're mentioning Huxley. Some people are mentioning Huxley here. You might want to check that out, readers, as well, as a really good book, introduction to sort of the history of the consciousness culture, but also specifically this idea of a post-religious religion, because it's using religion and there are religious structures to it, but there's a kind of horse lover fatness to the religious structures, and that you're using them for some much needed objectivity. So this is an interesting element to all of this. So maybe on this note, the comments are just streaming in. This is great, but we've gone about 45, another 15 minutes over. So maybe we can end here and wrap up and talk about next week, because this sort of bleeds right into next week. A lot of the questions, are going to be about, some people are asking about time and the Black Iron Prison, and William Klaus is riffing on print media and Euclidean space and Marshall McLuhan. William, great. So let's all do this next week and go deep with these things and talk more about the Empire Never Ended and everything else that we're chatting about.
I think that what I'd like to do, and I'd wonder what people's feedback on this, is just point to a folder of the exegesis for next week, and that we collectively look at that folder, which requires logging on to zebrapedia.psu.edu, or we could go to the print volume, which I'm also happy to do. So maybe we sort of get a sense of the virtual room, as it were, to see if people want to go to the actual kind of PDFs of the original on Zebrapedia, which can be a little bit daunting, but are amazing. And we can even just do a few pages. Or we could explore, and I'd be happy to share my notes from my Kindle version of the exegesis volume with everyone, just like insofar as those might be useful as a kind of redaction of the whole thing. So I don't know. I'm feeling folder 53 for some reason. I'm feeling like I want to point people to folder 53 and collectively investigate that. I often go back to it as kind of a keystone for me.
So why don't we do that? Folder 53, note everybody. Zebrapedia, Stuart says. Tessa says she just joined. Zebrapedia. Erica says zebra.
Cool.
I'm hearing all zebra.
Cool.
Sounds good, says Warren. Great.
And I'll share some fragments during the week from it that are inducing divine madness in me. And
Excellent.
then we can reconvene next Monday.
Perfect. That'll be our culminating session. So, thanks everybody, and thanks Rich. As always, it was wonderful, and I took a ton of notes. And
thanks, Jeremy. I really appreciate it. And Dan and William and everybody, Erica, Lindsay, everybody who commented. I learned a lot. And Tessa, of course, always. So excited to have Tessa on Zebrapedia. That is going to be interesting. Right?
All right. Yeah.
It's closing some kind of loop there.
Yeah.
We'll have to see if there's a divine flash of light that occurs.
Well, I'm glad Tessa will be joining us then. Yeah. And you need a million reminders. Don't worry, Tessa. We'll be tagging you throughout the week. I'm sure on our Facebook page, which if you haven't joined, check the email, because there's a link to that. There's a Facebook group now for everybody, PKD, VALIS, and Practices of Ultra Meta-Cognition. Just type that into the Facebook chat or header, the nav bar, and you should find it. All right. Great, everybody.
Okay, everybody. Thanks. The empire never ended, but neither did the light.
Well said. All right. Take care, Rich.
All right. Bye.
See you next week. Bye, everybody.